Good evening. I'm Dr. Devaka Gunawardena from the Yukti Collective. I'm here with my co-host, Dr. Ahilan Kadirgamar from the University of Jaffna. We're here with three esteemed guests who I'll be introducing in a moment. But just briefly, I wanted to introduce our collective, which is a plural forum to support working people's movements and struggles for democracy and justice in Sri Lanka. Yukti recently had a launch event at the Bandaranaike Memorial International Conference Hall last month. We also had a webinar recently with a former senior economist from the International Monetary Fund. And of course, this recent week, we've had 7 experts visiting us. And we've had a public event where we have discussed issues such as the IMF and debt restructuring. And so now I'll take this opportunity to introduce our 3 guests. Here with us today, we have Dr. Charles Abugray, Executive Director from International Development Economics Associates Network. We have Dr. Hashim Rashid from University of Pennsylvania, and also a member of the Alternate Law Collective in Pakistan. And then we also have Christina Rabine from Jubilee, Germany, and Eurodad. So we want to welcome you all today for this roundtable, and we're hoping that we can have a productive conversation. So to start things off, I just wanted to briefly ask, and because, we've been talking a lot about these issues, I think part of the benefit of having experts from other places visit Sri Lanka is also to get a sense that this is a broader global debt crisis, right? Now, Sri Lanka, of course, in 2022 defaulted for the first time in its history. But of course, there have been recurring patterns of debt crisis around the world. And so we're wondering, to what extent do the IMF solutions help or hinder an actual resolution of these crises? For example, can we consider this actually a debt trap, which Sri Lanka will continually have to endure until we identify an alternative? But I wanted to also pass it over to my co-host and just ask Ahilan, do you have any other thoughts?
Yeah, thank you, Devaka. I think Charles, Christina, Hashim, you know that Sri Lanka is going through one of its worst economic crises, and there's a lot of suffering that comes with it. And the cause of the crisis, it's often said in Sri Lanka to be corruption, right? That is why we got here. But at the same time, I think we know that many countries around the world are also going through similar debt crises. So, Charles, maybe I thought we could start with you. What is the situation in Ghana, where you're from? I know you're very active all over Africa. How is this, where did this debt crisis come from? And how is it affecting the everyday lives of people?
So first, there are 70 odd countries that are around the world in all 3 developing continents that are experiencing various forms or the other of debt distress. Some defaulting, some on the verge of default, some taking very harsh measures to avoid default. Harsh meaning they are raising taxes ruthlessly on their people, cutting down on essential services on their people in order to avoid formally declaring bankruptcy and going to the IMF. So this is a global, worldwide problem. It's a serious problem. This time affecting not only the poorest countries, but middle-income countries broadly, middle and low middle-income countries. So if you put the populations together, we are talking about billions of people that have affected by this. On the African continent, more than 50% of the countries are in debt distress or teetering on debt distress. And they range from Egypt, one of your biggest economies that's currently going through a crisis, and teetering on the verge of bankruptcy also. But for the geopolitical positioning of Egypt, it will be in as bad a situation as Ghana. That's also defaulted just about the same time as Sri Lanka defaulted. Zambia, that defaulted just about the same time that Sri Lanka defaulted, and so on. So it's very widespread and getting worse. It is getting worse because each of these countries that are experiencing these problems now have a different type of debt profile. So it's a new development in the nature of this debt crisis. And all of them share one important characteristic, which is that in the late 2000s, 2007, 2009, thereabouts, all of a sudden, money was cheap. It was coming from the United States mostly after the international financial crisis. The Americans wanted to rescue their banks, and so Treasury basically pumped in a lot of money into these banks. And so this liquidity, there's lots of money roaming around, investors, including the banks, were looking for a place to put it. At that time also, interest rates in the developed economies, the United States and Europe, was so low, it was close to zero, that if you had money hanging around in your banks or you are a private equity investor, you were looking anywhere where interest rates are higher. And this is the reason, this is how is it that these bonds, these international sovereign bonds, were pushed down the throats of countries that were simply not prepared to absorb them. Low-income countries, low middle-income countries whose economies were very weak and they're very dependent on one or two commodities or on tourism, where one shock destabilizes the economy. So yes, in all of our countries, we have governance problems. We have corruption problems. And we have to deal with governance and corruption problems. But even if we dealt with governance and corruption problems, that would not have addressed the fact that all of a sudden, interest rates in the United States and Europe have gone up again. So what you have borrowed, your debt burden suddenly doubles and triples. Not by any fault of the governments and their internal corruption, but because the international financial system has reacted like this, and suddenly countries are in distress, they can no more borrow and recycle. They can no more borrow cheap and pay back the loans that they have already borrowed because interest rates has exploded. Certainly not because of corrupt governments, but the international financial system.
Yeah, Hashim, maybe we can come to you. So, Charles mentioned Egypt as being maybe geopolitically important. You're from Pakistan, a nuclear power, and also considered geopolitically important. I assume over the decades you got a lot of aid from different actors. But what is the situation in Pakistan in terms of what are people facing? Is it any better than you're visiting Sri Lanka after a few years? Is it any better than here? Are they also going through the similar troubles? What is the situation of ordinary people there?
Thank you, Aylan and Devika. Very similar. But just to add to Charles, I think one of the important things to say is it's in addition to the sovereign bonds issue, is the fact that the IMF programs do not work. Pakistan and Sri Lanka have both been in IMF programs since 1965. Our countries sort of share that legacy of our economic policies being defined, if not 100%, but at least at 90% by the IMF. Our fiscal budgets are controlled by the IMF and World Bank. The way we structure reform in particular sectors, whether it's agriculture, whether it's energy, whether it's taxation, it's very much determined by the conditionalities of IMF programs. So the idea that we have independent economic policy itself needs to be questioned. And I think that sort of is a good segue into sort of thinking about Pakistan. The same year as Sri Lanka went into debt default, Pakistan suffered the biggest floods in its history. We were asking the international community for at least $20 billion. The same year, the IMF chose to not give us what were very small EFF, something like 300 million tranches which would have backed our economy and given us some breathing room in a time of climate crisis. Let's also remember this is the time when the IMF was pretending, as it is still pretending, to care about the climate. Kristalina Georgieva, the managing director of the IMF, kept talking about Pakistan and different forums, saying how she had been to Pakistan in the 2010 floods, which were also quite severe, and that she cared about Pakistan. But if the IMF cares about Pakistan, then extreme climate events are a time in which you give a country breathing room and not start an austerity program. So the same year as Sri Lanka defaulted on debt, Pakistan was almost on the verge of defaulting on debt. We pretty much ran the same kind of measures for a full year, starting in May, running till May 2022 to May 2023. We implemented the harshest austerity measures. Energy prices doubled, fuel prices tripled. Our currency was devalued by at least 250 to 300%. There was a massive squeeze on the poorest at a time in which at least 1/3 of the population was trying to recover from the floods. So our economy massively contracted, very similar to the Sri Lankan economy. And then 1 year later, after implementing a range of preconditionalities, so we're implementing preconditionalities in climate distress and debt distress, while the IMF does not even fulfill its own commitments. So that's the kind of state that we've been in. And for us, I think the question of the IMF as a benefactor that's giving us the right kind of policy guidance really needs to be questioned by the long history of the IMF's interventions. I mean, we had a sort of Pakistan is negotiating a new IMF deal, which is likely to be this month or next month. And in preparation for it, we wanted to have a chat with the executive director of the director of the Pakistan program, and we asked her
this is your group.
The Alliance for Climate Justice and Clean Energy in Pakistan, and we wrote a letter, and they invited us for a meeting at the Ministry of Finance in Pakistan. So the IMF director is sitting in the Ministry of Finance. They don't even have, apparently they don't have the money to get their own office.
That kind of actually dovetails, though, with a broader question I have. Given, for example, in Germany and in Europe in general, there's a strong emphasis now on the need to address climate change, right? How would you say, Christina, that Germany or other countries in Europe are reconciling these goals with the fact that there remains punishing austerity for many countries in the global south? I mean, isn't that a major contradiction? You know, I mean, I come from the US, for example, where they're pledging all this money for climate funding or whatever it is, but then at the same time, they're basically telling other countries, you know, don't try and use public funds, you know, cut your budgets, right? But given the kind of crisis that Hashim is also describing, what sort of interventions are possible?
Maybe first of all, there is definitely this contradiction of generally this whole dynamic around we need to invest much more in climate fight, actually support countries in the global south, right, to invest much more in climate adaptation and climate change. There's lots of discussions on debt and climate, and especially debt vulnerabilities, and in what ways debt vulnerabilities actually contribute kind of to climate change, right, and make it impossible to adapt and mitigate. But then when it really comes to debt restructurings, when it comes to IMF programs, right, it doesn't translate at all, right, to the programs, to the way debt is being restructured, right? So for instance, when debt relief is being calculated, right, it doesn't play any role, right, whether like what investment needs countries have when it comes to climate change or other agendas, right, the 2030 agenda, right? There's all this talk about that, all this talk about we need new methodologies, right? We need to include this, but it's just not happening, right? Because and then when you talk to them and ask about that, it's always about, well, the IMF is not a development institution, right? It doesn't have a mandate, right, to do these things. These are things for development ministries, right? It's not a thing for finance ministries and central banks, right? So you have this rhetorics, and then you have actually this very narrow mandate, right, or this kind of rhetorics around that.
That in fact undermines that
It
development.
absolutely undermines, exactly. And what you just described about how there is this rhetorics, and Kristalina visiting Pakistan, right? And then looking at the austerity, I think you see this in so many other areas, right? There's, for instance, a very strong narrative on female labor participation right now, right, at the IMF, right? There are papers and whatever policy papers, and then you look into the programs, right? And you actually see austerity exactly in these areas, right? So there's this disconnect, right, between the way these institutions, but also countries, right? So Germany is a very important shareholder of the IMF, right? So it's kind of shaping both the policy agenda, but also the programs, right? So you see a huge disconnect between kind of presenting the public image of being a responsible institution, like prioritizing global public goods, right? And then what's actually happening in countries and what support they get.
So hasn't the IMF changed? I mean, we saw the IMF as this kind of mean, lean animal in the, during the structural adjustment period in the late 70s and 80s. And people say, well, the IMF has learned its lessons. It's now also trying to support people, help them out. Has there been any change? How would you...
So I think one thing that has changed from the 80s, right? I mean, really looking at the 80s to now, is this kind of micromanagement, right? There were kind of really micromanaging programs, right? And now it's really more about the kind of macro targeting, let's say. But I mean, what is definitely an issue is what they included. I mean, in general, they say we need to look at social protection, right? And we make sure that this necessary belt tightening that needs to take place to bring the country back on track, right? That this is not going to hurt the poor, right? That we make sure that still social protection plays an important role in fostering, right? That social protection is going to be improved. What you can then see, for instance, you usually have things like subsidy cuts, right? And then the idea is, I mean, this is about, let's say, prosperity, let's say, of the middle class and the poor people. And then there's like, let's say, so what they say is like, we need to be more efficient, right? And what we do to be more efficient, we will target the social protection to those that really need it. And then what they do is like putting a little bit of budget into kind of targeted social protection programs, cash transfers, these kind of things. But like that actually dismantle, let's say, sometimes universal social programs, right? That actually supported also the middle class, right? Which then are just left, let's say, poor in a way, right? But there's this rhetoric of look at us as a socially responsible institution. We make sure you get out of the crisis and your society is not being hurt, right? But in the end, like if you really look into what is actually being allocated to social protection, it's really minimal. It's absolutely marginal compared to what is actually being saved. Then we really need to look at where is this actually being spent at, and it's not spent in social protection. If you like, I would actually like to react to something that was just being said on. I'm coming from Germany and from the EU, right? This whole thing about corruption, right? Yeah. This is actually the standard narrative, right? The reason for debt crisis is corrupt governments that just mismanage their economies, right? That's the since, I don't know, 20, 30 years, right? When it comes to debt crisis, that's the narrative. Full stop, right? There's no other responsibility, right? And so that means that actually the only thing you need is actually it's adjustment programs. It's more capacity building of very weak administration. So this is the kind of what is being actually done by that is distracting from the kind of responsibility that's there for crisis. It's actually kind of neglecting that there are two sides to the coin, right? So you always, when you give out a loan, you also have a creditor on the other side that gives the loan. What you just described about this abundant liquidity that was there, right, on capital markets, just in looking for profit. That, I think you said it very well, it was just pushed down the throat of countries. Ghana, when I look at them, there was actually, I remember this 10% bond, right, that Ghana contracted, and the World Bank actually gave a guarantee, right, so that Ghana was able to kind of issue the bond. And they even breached their own statutes, right, by giving this guarantee, because it was very clear. I mean, this is very high interest. Actually, Ghana already had a high risk of debt distress, but they just wanted, right, that Ghana gets this commercial borrowing. They were like, it's this Western private finance first narrative in development finance, and they're just really pushing it and even breaching their own statutes. So there is this question of who's actually responsible, right? And by having this narrative around corruption, right? You're just neglecting the other side of the coin, right? Which is then, well, just being then off the hook.
That kind of goes to another question I had, which is, you know, if we have this idea of corruption, for example, you know, how we frame it. I was reading a paper on Ghana, for example, that talked about how across Africa in general, right, there is a tremendous amount of income flowing out through foreign direct investment, right? Even here, when we talk about corruption, we never think about the fire sale potentially of state assets, right? So it's always a question of somehow, you know, pinning the blame on certain actors while obscuring the role of others, especially the involvement, relationship of, you know, multinational conglomerates. So that's one question I had, but, you know, how does that apply, for example, in Africa? I was wondering, broadly speaking, is there a different narrative of corruption? And then the second question I had too, and, you know, this is for Charles, but I guess in general, if others, you all have your thoughts, which is, you know, in a crisis that like the one Sri Lanka is facing right now, it's a depression, right? We're talking about a cumulative contraction of the economy by almost a fifth, right, over the past several years. Now, when you're thinking about what you need to prioritize economically, is it really about reducing corruption, or is it actually about stimulating the economy? And so why does this sort of corruption narrative take hold, even though in this moment especially, the economic need is to support people, basically? So I was wondering, you know, in terms of Ghana too, what's been the effect of the crisis, you know, the overall distributional impact, and again, how does that link back to this whole corruption narrative?
I mean, back up. I have this terrible habit of always backing up before the question. I want to back up on two things before this response to the corruption discussion. One is the IMF and climate change. A cynical view of the IMF's approach to adjustment, which is basically contract expenditure, contract the economy so that it comes to balance by releasing foreign exchange to pay debts. That contracting process, somebody said very cynically that this is the backdoor way of getting poor countries to pay for mitigation and to move away from the capacity to adapt and grow to actually contributing to reducing carbon emission. Because you consume less fuel, you consume, and so on and so forth. It's an issue that really needs to be carefully looked at. The second thing, again, is the IMF a little better now than the past? No, actually, it's much worse. You see, in the past, a standby agreement and a letter of intent would specify in detail what a country does. So that was micromanagement. But at least you have an opportunity to negotiate. Right now, the IMF now has an approach where they push the country to do the harshest things before the formal agreement. This is the way that domestic debt restructuring was pushed on Ghana. It's not in the agreement. They had to do it before. So there's a prior action which is not written down.
That was true in Sri Lanka also for 1 year.
This is
we had all
insidious.
the prior actions.
This is insidious, basically because it doesn't make the negotiation transparent. So they are much better now in marketing themselves. And this is because of the engagement with civil society. It's a sleek public relations exercise because the main framework of an IMF program has not shifted one bit.
And they come and meet us here in Colombo all the time also.
Exactly. You see it in the debt sustainability analysis. The fact that, say, in Sri Lanka, as in Ghana, you must save 8% of GDP to pay debt. It's in it. And that you must sacrifice growth in the medium to long term in the hope that some years down the line, you can start to grow. And then you hope that there's not another shock. And that the lack of growth in 3, 4, 5 years does not have a cumulative effect on growth. So in a sense, It's very insidious. The third way in which it's insidious is that in the early days, we did have public servants that were skeptical about the IMF. We still had a sort of Keynesian, more like people who believed in the role of the state who were in government. Now, over 2-3 decades, everybody who runs the state is neoliberal.
They're trained by the IMF.
Exactly.
Right.
So now you will build an alliance between the IMF and your domestic elite.
Yeah.
And so you have a collective, one side against the people. And both of them are now trying to explain that they must do this, although the adjustment cost is on the poorest people. So it's insidious in that second way. The corruption conversation is definitely one-sided and insidious. As I said, so there's your second point about illicit capital flows, which I'll explain in a minute. But so why is it that the American economy was not stable enough to keep interest rates low, having pushed countries to go into the private capital market? What were they doing? They're financing wars. They pumped a lot of money into the COVID exercise, a lot of which was very corrupt. I live in Britain sometimes, and it's the same conversation on how procurement through COVID was corrupt. All of that led to domestic inflation. So the inflation coming in the US, and my experience in Britain, and I'm sure most part of Europe, which is also non-transparent, corrupt procurements, translates into higher interest rates. The poorer countries have no role in it. That side of corruption is not discussed.
Yeah.
It's not as if there is no procurement corruption in advanced economies. It is not to say we shouldn't deal with our procurement corruptions, but it is that it is an incomplete explanation why countries are in crisis. And of course, yesterday, somebody from a political party was curious, said, I hear that Ghana is the 6th largest producer of gold. Gold is like a hot cake. How on earth can Ghana be bankrupt, can't pay its debts at default? He was so curious, he followed me into my hotel room to interview for an answer on this matter. You see, first and foremost, many poor countries that have natural resources were forced through structural adjustment. Always remember that the World Bank works hand in hand with the IMF. The IMF does the macro aggregates. The World Bank has loans to restructure the sectors. They don't work separately. That is why they have a country assistance program which is complete. The macro program and the structural sectoral change program. The fire sales privatization comes from the multilateral development banks. They have to do it to meet the macro target.
Right.
So all the gold mines were privatized. Countries, my country gets only 3% of the value of gold that is exported. You get absolutely almost zero corporate taxes because they inflate the import costs, the cost of doing business, and deflate the value of the gold that is actually sold, and they move the surplus into a tax haven. So once you inflate the cost of the doing business and deflate the amount of profit you have, corporate tax, it doesn't matter what percentage is it, it's almost nothing. So you have these natural resources, but you have these complex processes of taking the resources out. This is how the tax justice movement, which our members are here, are trying to deal with this issue, creating non-transparent mechanisms by which poor countries are cheated both of their foreign exchange share and of their tax revenues. That, for me, that processes of cheating poor countries and taking their wealth out is corruption.
Well, maybe come to Hashim. Charles mentioned that the World Bank and the IMF work hand in hand. What's been the experience? I mean, clearly that's the experience in Africa. What's been the experience in Pakistan in terms of these, what we call these international financial institutions? You know, our part of the world, we do need development finance, otherwise how do we develop? But how is the World Bank faring in Pakistan?
I think it's important to remember that sometimes people get bogged down by what the World Bank was in the 1950s and 60s, where the World Bank was, in some ways, a developmental lender. It was political. Let's be clear. I mean, Ghana went into a debt trap because of a dam financing project. Pakistan similarly went into debt traps because of dam financing. But at that point, there was a developmental agenda to the World Bank, shaped very much by the Cold War and the priorities of the Cold War. So the countries that the US was looking to bring on its side would get these developmental loans. There was the sort of Korean experiment happening where sort of massive money was being pumped into the so-called miracle story of South Korea, which, I mean, arguably was an American colony that had just come out of the Korean War. By the 1980s, though, the World Bank itself changes its tune, and it works very much hand in hand with the IMF in Pakistan. So 1970s, Pakistan has a socialist government. We have renationalization. 1978, there is a US-backed coup. An Islamist general, Ziaul Haq, comes in play, effectively used to sort of beat down the Soviet Union in the Afghan war. But what people don't want to talk about, partly because most economists in Pakistan are neoliberals, is that Zia's policies, or the Zia period, is where neoliberalism starts and Pakistan enters new World Bank and IMF programs. And since 1978, we begin processes of agricultural price deregulation, the removal of subsidies. Agricultural subsidies are reduced to 10% of what they were as a percentage of the GDP from 1978 to 1988. So that's significant process, including, for example, the destruction of the Pakistan railways happens because in 1985, if I'm not wrong, the World Bank issues a directive saying that the future of transport is roads rather than rail. And you need to move money out of rail and into roads. The way it operates in Pakistan is that the Pakistani military creates its road transport company, puts the same general in charge of rail and roads, all negotiating with the World Bank. The World Bank's fully cognizant of what's happening here. Rail freight is redirected into military-run road transport, which causes the railways by the end of the 1980s to become not profitable anymore. So therefore, the railway starts becoming a burden. Similarly, in the 60s, the World Bank was kind of part of a larger conglomerate of forces that were funding power sector projects that were run by the state. By the 1980s, it begins to push for a independent or private sector-led power policy. 1994, Pakistan issues its first World Bank-backed independent power producer policy. The first power plants we build are actually built by US companies who have those contracts. 1997, we do exactly what Sri Lanka is going through this week, I hear. The unbundling of the power sector. And that happens in Pakistan while the military actually takes over the power sector, bans the power sector unions, and effectively begins this process of creating these separate distribution and generation companies, which are now $9 billion in debt of each other. And that then becomes the next logic by which the IMF and World Bank collaborate in saying, you need to keep restructuring the power sector. You need to keep privatizing. This might be the year we finally sort of privatize the distribution companies in Pakistan. and that this will fix it. The other thing to add, as a maybe a shorter example that we can talk about later in more detail. In 2002, when the IMF stopped giving money to Pakistan, the World Bank also stopped its programs. But it also issued something called the Country Climate and Development Report for Pakistan. When we kept sort of pressuring the IMF that it was not fulfilling its sort of climate obligations, similarly to the World Bank, Pakistan gets a standby agreement in June or July of 2023. That agreement now has climate conditionalities in it. So the IMF agreement says Pakistan needs to agree to its sort of CPMA, which is sort of climate sort of investment analysis system, and the World Bank CCDR to design its own climate adaptation program plan. But effectively, the climate adaptation plan of Pakistan now is the World Bank and IMF's program. So they definitely are the same institution. And in the springs, when I asked this question,
at the IMF World Bank meetings in the spring.
At the IMF in World Bank meetings in Washington this April, effectively they quite clearly said, this is one of our biggest successes, that the IMF has accepted the World Bank's CCDRs as if they are two separate institutions.
Okay. Yeah. Christina, maybe we'll come to you. I mean, we're talking about finance. Is it from the IMF? Is it from the World Bank? Definitely developing countries need finance. But as Charles said at the beginning, much of it is coming from the international capital markets, right? And people say, so you don't have the conditionalities of the World Bank and the IMF. You can take the money and do whatever you want. It's a private business. In fact, many of our neoliberal think tanks here say it's much better because the market logic will work. These bondholders will discipline you. If you don't follow the rules, if you don't keep your house in order, they will leave. What do you think of this, and how are people in Europe thinking about this?
Yeah, a very important point. First, I would actually like to do the same and back up a little to make one point on the IMF, which nicely links to this question. What I heard the last 2 to 3 days is like, there's no alternative to the IMF. It's going to save us, which links to this idea. It helps us getting our house in order, right, and attracts the investment that we need.
In fact, the end point of our IMF agreement is to go back to the bond markets, the Sri Lankan in 2027.
Yeah, exactly. And so it at first sight feels like the IMF's interest, right, is supporting economic recovery of Sri Lanka. It's like prioritizing Sri Lanka's interests. I think we need to kind of ask again this question, whose interest we are actually looking at. When I think you mentioned the domestic debt restructuring at some point, right? Or you mentioned it. There was a domestic debt restructuring in Sri Lanka, right? The only reason that this was the case is because bondholders actually asked for it to come to the table to negotiate at all, right?
So our pension funds were cut because the bondholders pushed us into that.
Because they wanted to reduce their losses, right? And I'm coming in a minute to that. When you look into the IMF program, right? So there was the DDR, the domestic debt restructuring, bondholders asked for it. The IMF kind of pushed Sri Lanka to do it. That's one. If you actually look into the program, the whole debt sustainability targets that are in there, right? They are total crap. Actually, no one can explain to you, right, why there are these targets. Right. Other countries also in a debt restructuring right now, like Zambia, they have actually different targets, right? There's a 60% debt to GDP for Zambia and 95% debt to GDP for Sri Lanka. It doesn't make any sense. Why is this so different? If you look back to the Greek crisis, 2010, right? That was 124% debt to GDP, right? And I mean, we can speak about the Greek tragedy, right? But so it is like really. So one of the reasons, or maybe another thing that's actually, if we talk about austerity, right, and fiscal consolidation, if you look into the program, it says, but it's actually absolutely unrealistic what we ask. It's written there, right? They actually say it's unrealistic, right? We still ask it. Then there's something written that says, actually, that even after the debt restructuring, Sri Lanka is not going to be back on its feet, right? It's just written there that that vulnerabilities will still be high. So the question is, why don't you go back to the drawing board, right, and adjust targets, right? Actually, the IMF is breaching its statutes, right? It's not allowed to lend to countries where that sustainability is under threat, right? So this is taking place. And one of the reasons is because creditors, right? And there we come to the EU question, how the EU actually is discussing this. Creditors, do not accept high haircuts, right? So the IMF program, in a way, right, is adapted to the interests of these creditors. And the burden sharing, right? Who's actually taking the burden? It's pushed more onto the population through DDR, through austerity, right? And creditors actually don't have to take so much losses. And when it comes to the EU or to creditors in general, not only EU, also other like G7 creditors, the current discussion is, Sri Lanka is a bit of a test case, right? It's not just a unique debt restructuring, right? Right now, there are just a few post-COVID debt restructurings, Zambia, Ghana, and Sri Lanka. And Sri Lanka is actually one of the only test cases, let's say, out of a framework that the let's say, rich countries established, right, to restructure debt post-COVID. And everyone is very nervous, right? Can we actually show the world that we are able, right, to deal with all this debt, to actually bring China onto the table, to get private creditors on board? So what they are looking at right now is getting this done as quickly as possible, right? To actually have, the IMF meetings in April, they were saying like, look, we are so successful. Sri Lanka we are just 8 months, right? And Chad, we needed 18 months. So we are quicker, success. And the only reason why there's success is because you are not asking for any debt relief in a way, right? So just to make it clear, it's not about saving Sri Lanka, right? It's about, in a way, saving creditors, prioritizing creditors'
there was
interests.
no negotiation to push back, and that's why the agreement also came through quickly.
Well, I was not at the table, right? Sitting at the table with the government and IMF when they did the negotiations. But like what we perceive is, there is the IMF in a way deciding on targets, right? Having this discussion, the executive board of the IMF kind of ticking it off. And then it's in a way saying like, okay, you need to implement this program. However, if you actually speak to EU governments, they say, look, this is a government's program, right? It's not our program. It's not an IMF program. It's the program of the government, right? So one thing is actually, this is, even if it's in theory, but it's true, right? It is, one criteria of the IMF is to say this program needs ownership, right? This is very important, and there's a criteria for lending. That country needs ownership. So actually Sri Lanka or all other countries, they should actually stand up, right? And can really hardly negotiate, say these things are crap, right? Kind of prioritize, right? Recovery and in a way, basic human rights. So, and on to your question around like discipline of bondholders. Let's maybe take a step back and look again at all this money that was pushed onto countries, right? Back then, no one cared about repayment capacities of countries, right? They just wanted profit because there was no profit in the global north. No one looked at repayment capacities. Now things go wrong. Most of the commercial borrowing that took place, that was at very high interest rates. And that actually means, right, if you have a high interest rate, you're compensated for a default risk, right? So that's actually, if the country defaults, that's what you priced in. You already got the money for the default in a way. And the system we have, which is actually legitimized and facilitated by the IMF, right, is that this default risk does not have to be borne by these creditors, right? So can actually do all this reckless lending. You're being paid in a way, right? Either by being bailed out, what's happening in Pakistan with all this IMF lending, or by not giving giving the haircut that you actually need to give, right? So there's a bit of a question, who should be disciplined? So that's about the interest rates. And then there are actually very juicy things just happening right now, which is a very new pattern, I would say, in current commercial finance in a way. So there's the one thing about the high interest rate. Actually, you should take the risk. They don't take the risk. And then it's a bit like this whole argument about be careful with us, treat us gently, because if you don't, you will never get any development finance anymore. First of all, they don't have a development mandate. They don't care about your development, right? What they care about is returns, it's profit, right? And this is an argument that actually governments that take it very seriously and they touch them lightly, right? So right now, Sri Lanka, when we look at the debt restructuring of all other countries, it's very minimal what bondholders actually agree to. But then they think even this is actually too much to bear for us. We actually even want to be compensated for that. We want to actually we want to participate and benefit from your future economic prospects, even though we don't contribute to that, right? So what is being discussed right now in each and every debt restructuring is a bit of a like value recovery in a way. So we participate. We want to have, in the case of Sri Lanka, macro-linked bonds. That's maybe part of the media at some time, right? So it's like, if your economy is going better, we want to have even things, cash or getting, or having, that we don't need to give so much debt relief. In Zambia, right, it's about if the IMF says, right, you're able to carry more debt, right, like right now, you don't have to give so much debt relief. In Suriname, it's about oil revenues, right? They attach oil revenues, right? So there's this pattern of actually using debt restructurings to even benefit from your economic prospects, although they don't have the right to, and the lending was not on that basis, right? So there's this kind of extraction, right? Yeah. Like as heavy extraction as possible through a very broken system of the financial architecture and the debt architecture.
So that kind of brings me to this question, what constitutes success, right? I mean, if success is just about repaying your creditors, where does development basically enter into that picture? I mean, in Sri Lanka, for example, in 2023, over 1 million households were disconnected from the electricity grid, right? You've heard about statistics like child malnutrition skyrocketing, right? But as part of these, IMF agreements, how does development factor into this, if at all? And then my other question is, okay, so let's say the IMF essentially is functioning as a guardian of the interests of creditor countries, specifically the private creditors within those countries. Are there now also potentially points of tension or points where people can start to push back and to say, look, you claim to represent the global financial system. You claim to represent, financial stability. But actually what's happening now is preparing the grounds, preparing the conditions for a crisis of development, right? We talk about another lost decade, right? Just like Latin America had a lost decade in the 1980s. So I'm wondering, can we also start to decenter the IMF a bit here too and ask some broader questions about what would actually constitute, a real recovery program for countries like Pakistan and Sri Lanka and Ghana? So that's an open question. Yeah. And
Charles, I'd be interested. So what do we do? Christina says that, the bondholders have to be disciplined. Who's going to take the cane to them, right?
So I have two responses to that. Countries have to look after their own interests. So this is not a charitable activity. Bondholders are not charitable institutions. Neither is the IMF. The only ones that can look after our interests is us. So in a bad situation like this, we have to get our numbers right. So we are the ones that have to say, yeah, we are in a little bit of a mess. We have to do some changes in our economy and in our incentives and in the way we actually manage our expenditure. We have to do that. But in doing this, we want to maintain public services. In doing this, we want to ensure our economies are growing in 2-3 years, not stuck in 3, 4, 5 years. If that is the case, then what will it take from our side and from the creditor side? So the creditors have been paid, right? So it has been very clear. On the creditor side, an agreement from our side, an agreement is possible only if we meet each other at some level based on what we are negotiating for. What is the fallback if the creditors say they don't agree? Well, then we learn from Argentina that it's actually possible to pay off the IMF loan. Actually, you have reserves, all of our countries have reserves, and embark on a process of change internally based on internal conversations tenor political economy of burden sharing in a period of restructuring to put our economies in the right track.
But restructuring on our own terms.
Exactly. It should
right?
be possible to restructure on our own terms. And that is what the former finance minister for Argentina has been saying all the time. First, do your numbers. After we have done our numbers to protect our own interests, we negotiate on the basis of our numbers, not the IMF's numbers. The IMF numbers has to satisfy creditors. This is what we have to be very clear. It doesn't mean that, and there may be staff members of the IMF that sympathize with a country. But staff members of the IMF is not the IMF. It's the board of the IMF that matters. And they are the biggest shareholders of the IMF. Top of them is the United States, Germany, Japan, the United Kingdom. So that's that. So my second response to that is, are we prepared to say, in the next 10 years, we do not want to return to the sovereign bond market? That puts the negotiations in a different track. As one of our colleagues was saying, actually, there's not much room in the sovereign bond market in the next decade or so. And if you get back there, the interest rates will kill you. You will be very quickly back to another IMF agreement. You might as well start thinking of your restructuring, put aside the discipline of the bond market because of our appetite to go into the bond market and our reluctance to do our homework properly without the bond market. So maybe we should start having a conversation about, could we start talking to ourselves about what needs to be done if we are not afraid of the international sovereign bond market?
Maybe to all three of you, I mean, Charles's question, what is to be done, right? At many different levels.
Yeah.
First, of course, we have to get our numbers right, particularly in the global south, and set our priorities right and so on. But at the same time, what can be done internationally? There is talk of the need for a new international financial architecture. Christina, maybe you can touch on that. There's the idea of a debtors coalition, right? Countries like ours who've been debted, maybe we have to come together and only then we can come to an agreement. Okay, for the next decade, we won't float any sovereign bonds. What can be done? How should we work together? I mean, I think this has been a very rich experience for us to be able to have these 7 international experts here talking to us and sharing experiences. So maybe we can slowly, each of you could give your responses, and I'm sure then Devaka would want to also give his thoughts from Yukti's point of view, and maybe we can wrap it up. Maybe we start with Hashim, then Christina and Charles.
I think maybe highlighting one of the impacts of one of the issues that keeps coming up, this issue of corruption, is that people who buy the corruption discourse seem to think that there's something wrong entirely within our countries, that is internal to the country, that is causing the crisis. That means that when we negotiate or don't negotiate in many of our cases, we actually do it alone. And at the same point, we kind of forget that there were other countries that are facing the same crisis at the same time, negotiating with the same institutions, whether they are the IFIs or the bondholders or bilateral sort of lenders or multilateral lenders. And that kind of situation is one that has been maintained as a strategic exercise. I mean, they know that if countries will start talking to each other, there is the possibility that they can negotiate collectively. So the numbers that Charles is talking about are, of course, each country has to do their own, but we also need to do our numbers collectively and see what that means in terms of global financial flows, what it means for these policies cutting across, what does it mean for the shrinking of global South economies, which is consistently happening. It very much looks like it will be a lost decade. It's already so much is lost. How are we going to gain back the 20 to 30% of our economies that we've shrunk in the past 3 years? Sri Lanka and Pakistan's economy are sort of back a decade. So we need to regain that and then move forward. The problem, though, is that in the current political configuration within our countries, and we're in a tight space because most of our economic experts have become neoliberals. It is a strategic process. It has taken place mostly because a scenario was created in which almost all economists were looking for either a USAID project or a DFID project or money to get to the head of the Hydra, the IMF and World Bank or ADB as funding their projects. Effectively, that means that in this process, we need a new economics that breaks away, that allows us to set our own targets and sort of be able to critically assess what our needs are, not exactly in their language. And that is a difficult task. Of course, the fact that ideas exist is hope. That is a possibility. That also means that there are CSO networks that are trying to do it. Sometimes I think the conversations can get a little bit tricky, but the question of sort of debt sustainability analysis being something that is done independently is being brought up consistently in international forum. For us, there's also the question of sort of debt and development that's coming back into something called the sort of financing for development summits that are happening on the urging of the countries of the global South. There are key processes in which countries like Sri Lanka and Pakistan are often missing in their official delegations. And we need to exert that pressure on whoever our new governments are going to be to, in fact, go into these processes, to ask for a better deal, to ask for the UN or a different organization to regulate the World Bank and IMF. Because we need regulators for the so-called regulators at this point, because it is clear that they don't work after sort of 60, 70 years of experimentation with our economies. So we need something bigger, we need a coordinated effort, and I think that's what gives us room to sort of recover growth and development, start thinking about what a future might look like.
Okay, I will start maybe from the, let's say, global level and then coming to Germany, right? And speaking from a German perspective. So first of all, that things are as they are with Sri Lanka, with Ghana, with other countries. Actually, the past 30, 40 years is that debtor-creditor relations in a moment when things go wrong, right? This is governed by the Wild West. It's like the law of the jungle rules, right? There's just no overarching legal framework that you actually have in domestic systems, right? That is actually going to make sure that two conflicting claims, in a way, the claims of, let's say, protecting basic human rights and the claim of the creditor to be repaid, that this is balanced or that this is actually taken as a priority, right? It just doesn't exist. It exists and is very normal and accepted in domestic systems, but not when it comes to sovereign debt. So there have been repeated calls for something like a sovereign insolvency mechanism. Actually, Argentina kind of trumpeting such a mechanism 2014 in the United Nations. And then you had countries, and well, I regret that my country is part of that, but kind of blocking these processes. Right now, in the German coalition treaty, so the treaty of the current government coalition, there's actually a sentence saying we support the establishment of a codified sovereign debt workout mechanism, a codified sovereign insolvency regime. It's written in there. It's also written in there, we support vulnerable countries to actually get deep debt relief. That's in the coalition treaty agreement. So maybe looking at what is the possibility on the global level, there will be a couple of very central UN summits coming up. One of them, the fourth UN Financing for Development conference in Spain, and that is actually featuring very high. There are like heavy demands from debtor nations that the current initiatives and the current structures should be evaluated, right? And then there should be lessons drawn to actually kind of have a better architecture, given that this is part of our, I mean, this is what the government committed to do. And actually looking at like Pakistan, Sri Lanka, they in the past repeatedly called for something like a multilateral legal framework on debt restructurings, actually making sure this is an issue on the FFD conference in Spain and partnering with countries that are kind of in favor, actually want this, right? And like a very concrete thing that could happen is actually taking Sri Lanka, taking Ghana's experience, taking Zambia's experience, evaluate, right? What actually went wrong there, having like evaluate these cases, the debt restructurings along independent principles, right? They are, for instance, coming from this 2014 process, they're like, although there's no multilateral legal framework on debt restructurings, they adopted the UN General Assembly put onto the table a resolution on basic principles for debt restructuring, taking this and actually evaluating these cases, right? And Germany could finance that, right? Making sure this is being discussed at the FFD4. So that's like the global, like an agenda, like we need this mechanism. It's written in there, right? So support that it's going there. That's the one thing. Then, you know, Germany is actually a creditor of Sri Lanka, right? You know, most of the EU countries, most of the G7 countries, they don't really play any role, right? When it comes to the creditor position, right? Like bilateral lending is very low. But so when we usually have discussion with our government, it's like, well, we are not a creditor, we cannot do anything, right? So, but now Germany is a creditor of Sri Lanka, right? So there is, so it's about your own claims in a way. So Germany could do things differently, right? Could actually, I mean, there are a couple of things that could happen. One is actually just making sure, like, when there's the next program review of the IMF in the board, say no, right? This is crap. Saying like targets need to be adjusted. That, I mean, actually Germany, like all the others in the board, they're co-responsible for the situation that's there, right? Because they're ticking off the program and the reviews. So, I mean, but this is, I mean, not really change. But then, like, so when you look at Germany's creditor position, it may be low, but if you look at political responsibility, right? Actually, that's, if you look at the whole G7, that's actually very high. And why is that the case? Because in multilateral institutions, they are the main shareholders. If you look at bondholders, right, we are actually contracts. Contracts are in the US and the UK, right? So you have a much more political responsibility to make sure that restructurings work. So there can be a couple of things that happen. Like if we look at multilateral creditors, right, Germany could actually make sure that they are not just principally exempt from any debt restructuring. Actually, also Sri Lanka, right, has a very big share of multilateral claims, like in all the other countries, right? Making sure they are not just automatically exempt, right, but that there is a discussion how to include them. Which could actually incentivize China to come on board much better, because they actually say, we need better burden sharing, right? Why should I actually take all the burden, right? If bondholders don't and the multilaterals don't, right? That's you, the West. So then bondholders, there is a bit of a discussion, and you don't even need any global consensus for that, right? To establish national laws that would actually, in a way, force private creditors, right, to participate in debt restructurings and give a deep debt relief. There's discussions in the US, there are discussions in the UK, there are discussions in Germany, actually, right? So first of all, having a law in Germany, right, and also strengthen forces in the other countries, right? That's, I mean, especially when it comes to our coalition treaty commitment, a very important step. And then, I mean, Germany is part of the G7 and very powerful, right? So kind of encourage partners like US and UK to kind of establish the same laws. I think that's something on the national level, right? Which would actually make a very huge difference. And then there are, I don't know, 40 other, let's say, small things that Germany could do, right? From making actually sure and have a debate on realistic debt sustainability analysis, financing alternative debt sustainability analysis, including the climate change and development needs. So there are many things that actually could happen, right, if the political will is there. We actually have a paper which just says like Germany can do these 40 things, and that's something that we strongly push for.
First, everything starts national. A country must recognize that ultimately they must finance their own development. Which is that a government budget has to come out of the revenues that are internally generated. That is taxation, largely. And if you co-own a state-owned enterprise, that is profit sharing, that you don't need foreign exchange to finance a domestic expenditure in local currency once you have your own currency. So we have first to resolve the question of how to finance development whilst minimizing dependence on foreign exchange. We deal with the foreign exchange differently as a current account problem. And that means making the tax systems work. It is not only a domestic problem, which is efficient tax collection and equitable tax regimes, but it's also an international issue, which is an international regime that ensures that international companies, multinational companies, pay their fair share of taxes, and that countries can have their revenue, their taxation wherever a company operates. This is the conversation happening now at the United Nations on the International Tax Treaty. So that's very important. The second that is also important is to build on that. You manage whatever foreign exchange that comes in. You create the opportunities and the incentives for exports where you need to export to generate your revenues. So the tourism sector in this country works and so on, so expanding. That supplies the foreign exchange needs. But one of the things that is the experiment happening in BRICS, which we must all pay attention to, small economies like us might never join, but there are principles being put in place. Why on earth is one paying Indians or Indians paying Sri Lankans dollars for buying and selling things across the countries? Why do we need to do this mediated by dollars? So we can do payment systems that reduces the need for dollars, and if you build up international currencies that are internationally exchangeable, you use them for the strategic purpose of investors, your local business people wanting to buy machinery, or anything where they are supplied only through internationally exchangeable currency. So we need to think about this. We need to be interested in these payment systems that are being developed in order to reduce this dependency on the US dollar as small economies. So that also is very important. But the third is that one of the reasons why governments suffer is that there is no increasingly fewer and fewer sources of development finance. So the change of the mandate of the World Bank over the years and other multilateral institutions over the years have hurt small countries. Because when you have a balance of payment problem, it's not just a reserves question, it is also that you need affordable credit to invest in development. It is very worrying that the World Bank, and that also filters into the regional development banks, that their roles are changing into de-risking private investment. So the narrative that they say is that most of the money is in the private sector, that the multilateral institution will never have enough money to satisfy development, and that the thing that they can do is to leverage private capital. And so the conversations at the World Bank and the Regional Development Bank is about how the World Bank uses its money to de-risk. So the Ghanaian guarantee bond was one of these de-risking experiences. So we've learned that when they try to de-risk, they can't quite de-risk because they don't control international interest rates. So
it was still at 10%, right? De-risking, but still at 10%.
Still 10% plus all of the other changes that comes on it. Therefore, there's a serious discussion about development banking, development finance. So the international dimension, but there has got to be a domestic dimension. We have to revive a thinking about development financing, development banks.
Sri Lanka had 2 development banks that under IMF pressure were commercialized.
They all have become commercial, same as Ghana. And therefore, it's just financialization. Banks making profit on the back of make money, but not necessarily invest in the real economy. So we have to stabilize that as well.
Well, I mean, this has been an incredibly rich discussion, and I won't even try and summarize here, but I would just say broadly, like, I think we can all take away from this that, we had a very rich historical discussion, how the IMF, World Bank have changed over time, yet at the same time, the underlying sort of interests that endure, right? And which means that we have to think very critically about, who's being represented in these negotiations, who is ultimately benefiting from this entire process. Do bondholders represent the interests of the country? Do the domestic elites represent the country? Right? There are many different groups here. And I think, for example, Christina, bringing in Germany to show that there is ongoing discussion within the metropolitan countries as well about alternatives. So this is not just confined to Sri Lanka or to any one place, right? Globally, South-South, and also in terms of, progressives in the North, trying to think through critically, because at the end of the day, if we're thinking about the sort of interconnected nature of all these problems, right? It's not just going to be confined to Sri Lanka. It's not just going to be confined to Pakistan, right? We see globally how all these issues are coming together. And I think to add to this last point by Charles, I think this return to a paradigm of development economics, right, is really crucial. Because again, where is development in these sort of, macro targets, right, that the IMF, for example, is imposing on Sri Lanka, or which our elites have supposedly willingly accepted, right? But can we, start to think about the alternatives that have been obscured by this, emphasis on just, financial markets and discipline through that, right? So I want to thank you all very much. I think this has been very productive. Really appreciate your participation, and I don't know, Ahlan, if you had anything else.
No,
Yeah.
I think this last few days with all these experts visiting has been really useful for a wide section of us. And I think on behalf of Yukti, we really want to thank you for taking the time to come to Sri Lanka. Some of you have come for the second time or third time, and we hope you keep coming back and continuing this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.